Hello everybody, we're getting started. Yes, so welcome. This is the 2022 Richard F. Hanson Lecture and Award announcement. My name is Farad Erdem. I'm an assistant professor of architecture at ISU, and I serve on the architecture department's public programs committee. And so I'm here to introduce this year's Richard Hanson lecturers, Maura Rockcastle and Ross Altheimer, co-founders and principals of 10 by 10. After my introduction and before their talk, we'll have the award announcement for the 2022 Hanson Student Prize. This third-year undergraduate architecture studio award recognizes a student design project that best investigates landscape as a central and integrated part of the architectural artifact. And the panelists this year were the Hanson lecturers, Maura and Ross, and Deborah Hoffman, chair of the architecture department. And so I'll introduce our guests here. Maura Rockcastle has extensive experience working on large-scale projects, managing and navigating multi-headed stakeholder groups and complex public processes. With a background in printmaking and sculpture, Rockcastle balances a rigorous design approach with a conceptual sensibility rooted in process and craft. Her professional experience is focused on cultural, institutional, and public realm projects, including the High Line Section 1, Times Square reconstruction, and historic Fort Snelling revitalization. Her work spans many scales of landscape, from 4,500-acre parks to 5-acre urban plazas to small collaborative art installations. Rockcastle previously was an associate for James Corner Field Operations and the landscape discipline leader at Snøhetta. She holds a BFA from Cornell University and an MLA from the University of Pennsylvania, where she was awarded the Ian McHarg Prize for Excellence in Ecological Design, an American Society of Landscape Architects Certificate of Honor, and the Van Allen Traveling Fellowship. She has taught design studios at Harvard GSD, Yale School of Architecture, and the University of Minnesota College of Design. Ross Altheimer has led the planning and execution of significant cultural, community, and campus projects across the United States. His collaborative methods are rooted in art and the temporality of landscape, with the goal of building just communities and institutions through leveraging landscape's capacity for transformation. His projects include 38th and Chicago Re-envisioning, Minnesota Zoo Treetop Trail, and Lakewood Cemetery Welcome Gardens and Arboretum. Altheimer has taught and lectured nationally across the disciplines of architecture and landscape architecture, and was a 2014-15 Cleveland Fellow at the University of Minnesota's College of Design. He holds a BS in Architectural Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and an MArch and MLA from the University of Virginia, where he won the Nix Fellowship to study subterranean Paris. Prior to 10 by 10, he was an associate at Cohen & Partners and the director of landscape architecture at HGA. His work has won awards and recognition from AIA and ASLA Regional and National, the GSA Design Awards, and the Graham Foundation. He was also the 2013 Rome Prize Fellow in Landscape Architecture at the American Academy in Rome, where he studied infrastructure and myth in contemporary Rome. So please join me in welcoming them. So the awards announcements. Yeah.
Okay. This was a really difficult decision. I want you all to know that. We are incredibly honored and feel a little bit undeserving of being in this position to choose this. The total Hanson Prize is $4,500. We're awarding 2 projects, each with 3 students, so the prize will be divided equally. There was a ton of thoughtfulness and passion and innovation across the projects we saw today. Congrats to the faculty members and professors. There was beautiful work on those walls, and we're so blown away by all of you. In no particular order, the first project we'll announce is Reawaken. So McKenna, Armin, and Kyle, if you could please stand. We chose this project. There was thorough research. It was grounded by very rich and dynamic site considerations. It was very clear that the team had spent a lot of time on this site, and we're trying to understand it across a variety of scales and systems. There was a really innovative use of materiality and sensitivity to materiality and to water, which are all very relevant to the issues of our time, so congrats.
And that Can you all hear me?
Nice.
Oh yeah, look at that. It just does it for me. Yes? Okay. So the second award we want to announce is for the project Retrouver. I don't know how I did on that, but that's like high school French right there. And so I'd like Ben, is it Saad? Saad, yeah. And Tim to stand up. So this project was certainly near and dear to my heart, and I think for all of us, looking at new ways of thinking about death and remembering and memory. Certainly right now I think it's all sort of top of mind, but I think we were both really blown away by the clarity and simplicity of the project, the way in which landscape and architecture were sort of fused together in terms of the program, its relationship to this existing site, beautiful site of St. John's, and sort of the power, I think, of establishing a really sort of simple diagram that's really about this new ritual, a ritual of moving from life to death and celebrating loved ones, and remembering loved ones. So just want to say congratulations to you all, for all the projects today. It was really beautiful work. Again, as Maura said, congratulations to the professors. It's really lovely to have been able to kind of meet with you and see your work and be a part of your community for a little while. So, thanks so much.
So I don't know how many of you had heard of 10 by 10 before you knew we were coming. But
Raise your hands. All right.
Oh, yeah, okay. I was hoping at least maybe our mess up on the name. Well, we're 10 by 10. Ross and I co-founded the practice almost 7 years ago this May. We're made up of right now 17 amazing individuals. We've nearly doubled in size in the last year and a half, which is nuts. We're women-led. We have about 70% female, 30% male at the moment. And I think in the last years of growth and change during the pandemic, we're focused on spending a lot of time trying to become a practice that is all about radical transparency, that is embracing our mission. And Ross will talk about that a little bit more, but we're really focusing also on sustaining joy, especially right now, especially after the last 2 years, especially being in Minneapolis, where we continue to kind of contend with and face a lot of really challenging issues. So creating a healthy culture is top of mind, and we want to be a place where people stay and grow and want to be. And of course, we're pouring ourselves into our projects.
So we are a mission-led practice, and I think from the start, we really focused our work on really a methodology and process that considers and confronts the issues of our time. So those such as social justice, climate justice, environmental justice, religious freedom, trauma, fear, that those are things, and there are limits to which design can sort of take on, but that's our focus. And so just for us, clearly stating our mission and sort of our values is really important, and it reminds kind of all of us in our practice and even our clients to the work that we want to do, we are doing, that we can make change. And so really for us, this notion of designing for people and habitats, and that design can catalyze, inspire just futures, is really what sets, for us, it's a goal, it's a way of practicing, it's what unifies us as a whole. We'll also say that, being from the Midwest, we are 3 hours north of you all, and being in our community is really important. We're committed to working and being in place, working in place, and showing up in place. And you'll see in some of the projects today, 3 that are sort of more local and 1 that is more national. But this map starts to kind of show you within the Twin Cities over 7 years the footprint that we're starting to have in collecting these narratives and projects and they start to overlap, and we'll talk about some of that today. But that this geography is really important for us, and our hearts are there, and it also sets us up well to be working outside of our community as well. So it really matters for us too how we work. That we don't tie ourselves to a discipline. As Maura said, we believe in radical transparency, a lot of dialogue, mentorship, collective ownership, trust, gratitude, compassion, and most importantly, love. So that's the foundation for us.
So we're going to talk about a lot of the methods, kind of the how, and across different projects, the ways we begin to explore, question, decode, reveal, and test ideas. And all of these methods are really preceded by an idea of kind of resetting, of unlearning, of acknowledging all that we do not know. We're committed to an unfixed and open-ended process of discovery that requires that we choose to practice observing, documenting, and translating as a critical way of seeing. So how do we get there? How do we begin? Kai Naleski is a professor at the Department of Architecture at RISD. In her book, The Storm of Creativity, which I highly recommend if you have not read it or seen it, she writes about this idea of learning and how our practice can defy and challenge typical structures and modes of contemporary practice through a more process-based approach to the work. So she writes, questions have a remarkable power to undo preconceived choices, disrupt assumptions, and turn your attention away from the familiar. All of these lead to a more open mind. A creative process comes from displacing, disturbing, and destabilizing what you think you know. And when become agitated when we discover we don't know, and that compels us to go forward in search of knowing. She also writes that when you rid yourself of preconceptions through unlearning, there's an absence that is left behind, and that absence creates both the need and an awareness, and unlearning kind of unfolds in the way that it creates. So that impulse to know is a spark and a creative generator. So where do we go from this resetting point? How do we create for ourselves in each project a generative point of departure? What methods do we commit to as a practice to ensure that we begin intentionally in this way? So we call all of those creative methods. And we embrace these creative methods as ways of working not only to catalyze innovation, but to be used as a productive tool also for civic participation and community engagement, stakeholder engagement, measurable impact and collaboration across disciplines. And when we say creative methods, we're describing a wide range of things to observe, document, study, and research. There's an array of them here on the screen, and they're used across the lifespan of a project, not just in the beginning, but they begin to be a way for us to test and refine, to prove and question, and provoke kind of across all phases of a project. So in addition to unlearning and creative methods, questions for us are key. There was one team today that started their project presentation with a really provocative question, and it was an excellent way of starting. So I warned you then we were going to talk about it, and here we are. But without the questions, and we believe we lose the rigor associated with the kind of inquiry and the research along the way. And we dampen the ability to really challenge norms in a strategic way so that we can ensure the work is having an impact. So our questions generally are around these questions here. What do we see? How do we know? Why does it matter? And where do we begin? What is the role of discovery as design practice play in our collective future as designers? What norms are we challenging? What does it take to actually do this work? What is at stake and what barriers emerge? So today, throughout the lecture, as we're presenting these projects, we'd like to invite you to think critically about this act of questioning. Think about what questions your work is asking, what questions you want it to ask in the future, and what role does discovery as practice play in our collective future. We'd like to circle back to this at the end and hear a little bit more from you about that.
So it would be great if you just either pulled out your sketchbook or a piece of paper, because we know not everyone likes to ask questions at the end. Just to make sure that you do write down a question, because we'd love to hear from all of you. Also, it avoids a sort of awkward who's asking the question or is there a question. So we'd love it if you would all do that, and we'll collect them at the end.
So we'll run quickly through some of these strategies we mentioned for resetting and learning and the creative methods, and then we'll do a deeper dive into a couple projects. We might be running out of time because we started a little bit late, so we might have to skip one, or we'll see. We do a lot of recording, so through film or putting in motion experiments and studies that presents unseen phenomena, working with dry ice, for example. Pretty sure all of these are. Yeah. Next to a river, for example, reveals water flows and wind in these recordings in ways that still photographs, could not have captured. We utilize film and recordings in many meetings, especially over the last couple years where we're maybe not in person. So both virtually and in rooms like this where the outside is not present, it allows us to bring the landscape powerfully into the room and kind of ignite senses in a different way that shifts the conversation. Active photography is also a method we use quite often. Photographic methods are integral as a tool for measurement, documentation, fundamental layer for a lot of different types of representational media. The photographic methods are often, for us, tied to larger questions about decoding and revealing layers and forces like time or light or temperature, choice, sensory experience. A single photograph for us is rarely used in isolation, so these kind of serial methods. This was a project where we were inventorying the ground plane and the canopy above, kind of meandering as the body sort of chose to and was able to through a wild wooded forest in Wisconsin. So they were also documenting the kind of transitions in ecological communities and their own desire lines and time, all kind of stacking those together. Experiments using the materials of the site, the ice, the water, the mud, the plants. We love the qualities information that emerge from getting more intimate with what makes each place truly authentic. So how can these ice and mud studies emerge from questions like how do we understand the saturation or organic content of the river mud? How can we capture the wetness, temperature, and temporality present here versus a different site? We love the idea that we are building relationships with the landscapes that we work and deepening our understanding of them through spending time in ways that build familiarity in meaningful ways with the materials and phenomena of these places. It builds a deeper respect. Again, these questions of how we can capture the essence or authenticity of a character of a place, working to spark creative inquiry across a range of media, kind of touching and feeling and collecting is a big part of that. On the left side here are tape strips, just your typical 3-inch clear 3M packing tape pressed firmly against the ground. On the right are clay slabs or plaster casts made from clay slabs that we've used and pulled textures from objects or surfaces in a site. Or some of them are used with fingerprints made from, in particular that was with a deaf, community thinking about sign language and ASL and communication through different means, physical means. So these surround us in the studio and our studies that we come back to when developing details, finishes, surface textures for a project. Language and words are also a powerful creative method that we lean into. How we shake free preconceived notions of a place or a typical type of landscape. We need to be able to identify the biases we all are carrying with us in the work that we do. We often need to help communities see and acknowledge their own biases, and hopefully to see harm in some of the perspectives that we carry unintentionally. And words are one of the best ways to acknowledge some of the fundamental complexities and truths defining the land upon which we're being asked to work. Ownership is often unclear, untrue, and contested in so many of our projects. So defining what public space means and even the notion of place making becomes incredibly complex and often even offensive when you acknowledge these truths. So as we consider what methods to use to further study different sites or project questions, it's important to ask ourselves who we're designing for and how these different types of drawings are being read and understood by the various communities we're working with. This was with a project with some of our Dakota Indigenous partners in Minneapolis in the River Valley. So the question of drawing lines and boundaries around landscapes that are sacred and fluid doesn't resonate well It is not a way that they communicate or talk about these sites. So us testing how to represent idea of water or deep layers of cultural history that should not perhaps be drawn by lines is another way that we kind of test how we represent. We're also testing how we can understand community relationships through inviting them to participate in creative methods. This is a community tracing method led by a woman, Katie, in our office for the Cedar Lake, Lake of the Isles landscape plan. And we're looking for patterns of ritual and relationships that people and individuals, communities have with particular bodies of water, lakes in Minneapolis. Prototyping is another kind of way thinking about how to help communities participate in the making of these things that will catalyze change or help them test how to use spaces in different ways.
And I think this other method, and more I mentioned before, sort of decoding. So this is we're working right now on George Floyd Square, and one of our employees, Zan, made this graphic. We had a question about how do we begin to understand space and time, community occupation, the relationship of art, temporal program, and people, as it is also tied to larger events that are happening in the city and then nationally as well. So we make maps to give form to those things that are hard to understand. And we extract from them the notion we're undergoing of sort of a planning process. And we do this often on our projects where we're trying to find out what we don't know. And there's different methods, again, for how we begin to know that. And so we're carrying this forward as a method to begin to think about a future that we don't quite, know what that looks like yet. So the first project we'll talk about tonight is the Castile Peace Garden. This is a garden for Philando Castile in his memory and celebrating his life. The site is in St. Paul, or actually in Falcon Heights, which I'll talk about a little bit, this strange space in between. So the program for this is a small garden of memory and of celebration for Philando. So some of the questions we're asking in this project is, how can a design process itself reconnect community through the process of the rebuilding of the site? How do you design a space for healing, protest, and reconciliation? And I think in this project, and our other projects too, there's a question here about what are the limits of design and the capacity of design to actually make change. And how can a design process respect and bear witness to a tragic event? And we'll show you how some of our methods of knowing sort of play out. We have an amazing team on this project. We are lucky to be invited to join Formula Architects and artist Setu Jones in this project. And on the top, you'll see Valerie Castile and some of our project leaders on the upper right. So as I mentioned, the project is really about celebrating the life of Philando Castile and the telling of his story. It's a difficult story to tell, and I just want to make space for to acknowledge that what a large tragedy this was, and it remains to this day. That his life was taken. So the principles and mission of this project is really to create a contemplative communal gathering space for peace, justice, and healing for all. Really, it's about remembering Philando, healing the community, and catalyzing change. We work closely with the design team, client, and partners to establish these clear set of values, and we worked for a period of over 3.5 years through 3 phases of work, which we'll be showing you. Witnessing, preparing the ground, and building the garden. So as we were engaging with this project, the site it's a very strange site. It is the site of the Minnesota State Fair. There were the first ever flights, I think in 1910, over commercial flights or testing flights over that. It's been a place of spectacle. It's been a place of community gathering. It's drawn large people together. It's connected larger geographies. It was the Curtis Airfield for another 30 years within its coexistence of the State Fair. before they built that out. It was also kind of a strange invention. It's in the community called Falcon Heights, where a developer came up. We thought the name Falcon Heights would draw people to this community. And then it's also home to, it sits right on Larpenteur Avenue. And Larpenteur was one of the kind of contentious founders of the city of St. Paul, who really was lobbying the city to name an avenue after him. And they gave him kind of a rural road, which he was never really happy about. So a strange sort of set of histories. Also the question, as we're sort of in this phase of witnessing, how can we begin to understand and spatialize what happened, and how do we begin to sort of represent that? So testing ways of mapping and reconstructing the site history, the representation of this project in the media through video and clips, always and mostly initially from the perspective of the officer, and the media portrayal of his murder, which is, I think, typical of these kinds of events. And also the laying out of space and time for us to understand how the event unfolded, being critical to how we begin to understand and reconstruct the site. There's also a moment where the camera flipped and the perspective shifted from outside the car to inside the car. From Diamond Reynolds' perspective, we saw her, we saw Philando, and then we saw back to the police officers. And this went viral at this moment in time. So there was a shift in perspective in media, which is significant. Also strange in this, the contents of Philando's car were published. And so, we had an inventory of everything that was in his car that day. And, including the contents of groceries that he and Diamond had just purchased at the grocery store. So one of the things we did, is in this witnessing phase was really just to spend time on the site. And we went every week over the course of about a year just to see what was on the site, to spend time with the site, to get to know the site. It was a place of temporary offerings. Every day it changed. There were new signs, there were new offerings, more flowers, more plastic flowers. It was a space of, the kind of community love, showing up there. And this collection of offerings, it was our way of inventorying what was there, and understanding, that this was a space that was deeply connected to the community, and still, to this international community who had witnessed the tragedy. So after reading the site and doing some site design for 2 years and testing design ideas, we planned, for the site to go to this next phase, which is really preparing the ground and building the garden. So every year on July 6th, there's what's called Reconciliation Day, on the day of his murder. And his mother and the community come and gather. And so we were planting a garden. And so this kind of act of remaking the site, and this would be in year 4 of his passing. And so we built the site with the community. So one thing to mention on the day we were on the site, it was the day after George Floyd's murder when we were planting the garden. And I think, the relevance of what we were doing with the community, and also the amount of work that was still to be done. I think we were all thankful to be building the garden that day. And then the world, went through the same tragedy it just had, 4 years ago. So we planted the garden. We watched the garden grow for about a month and a half. And here's the celebration and Restoration Day honoring Philando. And we also, watched the site over time and how people used it, and where Valerie stood to give her speech to everybody. And she was standing in the garden speaking to the community. we watched the garden grow some more, and then we watched all the contents removed from the garden by somebody in September. Everything was gone, and we got an email from Valerie, just fraught, and said we had to remove the garden because people felt emboldened because of the garden that was there. So the next phase is really the building of the garden. So as I mentioned, it's a strange site. Even its location adjacent to Larpenteur. It is also was part of a beautification project on the edge of the State Fair. It's State Fair land. And so we had to be very careful about all the messaging and everything. And that landform that exists there is also from Phil, from one of the roads that the State Fair had been building, and they planted on that edge. And you can sort of see that small illustrated car, which is where Philando's car was parked. And so as we've been testing ideas and refining ideas, this question about how do you move through the site, how do you honor the site, and this idea of establishing a clear walk that organized everything. And one of the drivers for that walk was really ended up being looking at an EKG, and the form actually of a last breath. There are 5 elements that kind of compose the garden. One is Philando's bench. One is a cosmogram that celebrates Philando's life and geography. The walk that I just mentioned. The veil, which sort of separates the State Fair and the garden itself. And you can see kind of how those layers start to stack up. So one of the core elements of the garden is Philando's bench. The form of the bench was taken, inspired by the car seat from the Delta 88 that he was driving. And it celebrates the life and trajectory of Philando, starting with upright and laid back. And that was the position that Philando would drive in. Also, artist Setu Jones put together a cosmogram. This will be overlaid, but really celebrating the life and kind of connection to his various geographies that will be etched into the ground. And we started building it last fall, and you can start to see some of the garden coming together. You see the architect and artist sitting on Philando's bench. The procession of what that walk starts to feel as you approach the bench, this existing wood pillar that was placed there by the community when this on the day after he was murdered. Creating a new structure for offerings, the stairs becoming places to set objects, some of Setu's other pieces coming on site. And then also some of the larger changes. Larpenteur Avenue was officially renamed Philando Castile Avenue Memorial. So those geographies are being reclaimed.
What time should we conclude at? 6:30? Is that what we're? Yeah. We'll see where we're at the end of this project.
Yeah.
That might be a good place to close. So Louise B. Miller Memorial is at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. Gallaudet is one of the nation's only higher education institution in which all programs and services are specifically designed to accommodate the deaf and hard of hearing students and adults. Faculty, where our relationship with Gallaudet started in 2016 with an international design competition. We're partnered with Mass Design Group and Jeff Mansfield, who's a deaf architect and leads their Deaf Space and Disability Justice Lab. We did not win that competition, but the work our team did for that competition really started a dialogue and a relationship with the university, and 2 years ago led to an invitation for Mass to work on the memorial, and they invited us to join them in that project. So in 1952, Louise B. Miller is a mother of a deaf child, and other parents, black parents, filed a class action lawsuit against Washington, D.C. Board of Ed for the right of black deaf children to attend the Kendall School for the Deaf on the campus of Gallaudet. The resulting victory in Miller versus the Board of Ed pierced the Plessy versus Ferguson doctrine of separate but equal. So it's a very critical civil rights story that is really not, I had never heard of before, and is not really being told anywhere. Few people know about it. So we started work with an incredible team of black deaf faculty, staff, and alumni at Gallaudet who have been leading and stewarding the kind of idea of this project for years. Two of Louise's children, Gerald and Carol, are here with us and have been a part of numerous engagement sessions over the last 2 years, all of which have been virtual. We've actually never met these people in person yet. We're going for our first kind of sensory workshop with materials in about a month, but we also just finished the construction documents, so you can see there's a bit of a timing issue there. But the project has not been raised for yet, so there's also millions of dollars that need to get raised, so there is time to have this workshop, have it re-inform the construction documents as they need to be. Our design team is still led by Mass Design Group, their Boston office, and we have a much larger team of consultants supporting us, water feature consultants, lighting, maintenance and operations experts, and engineers. There's nothing like the kind of sensory garden we're proposing for her memorial that exists on campus. So how to kind of maintain this long term for this particular campus, which I think has only 4 grounds crew members, is a big challenge. The driving questions behind this work have evolved over the last 5 years, and some of these are kind of grounded by the competition, and some are newer for the memorial. But they're all sort of, again, grounded by this notion of deaf people create new modes of knowing, seeing, and making that are unique to the world. So the questions we're asking: what types of spatial strategies can create a heightened visual tactile means of spatial orientation to deepen sensory knowledge for all? And what does a black deaf space look and feel like? And how can we honor the black deaf experience in the landscape? So going back a little bit before I go forward to the memorial, I think the campus history and some of the competition work is relevant just to understand this community. The original campus was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1866, so it's a historic district on the National Register. The core of that historic campus is sort of our memorial site is the pink dot, and the historic campus is really kind of below that. So we're right on the edge of that, right in front of the conference center, which used to be the site of the Kendall School. So the brief for the 2016 competition was to reimagine the historic core and open up this western edge, kind of the white box, as a part of a collaboration between the university and local developers. The campus currently is not being very responsive or expressive of the rich relationship between deaf and hard of hearing experiences in the built environment. So the design teams for the competition were all asked to integrate the university's innovative kind of emerging approach to architecture and planning, known as Deaf Space, into the schemes. The university has been at a point for many years through which the entire kind of global visually performed realities of the deaf community are being drawn to the surface. The artistic and cultural production of the deaf community, which Jeff refers to as deaf craft, has the potential to really deepen this idea of sensory knowledge for all of us. The university kicked off the competition through a series of workshops to really reset the way that all these teams were coming to the table, how we all thought and sensed and listened. While each team included a deaf architect, most of us on the team had little exposure to deaf culture. So the workshops they set up for us were all about knowing through touching and feeling. We walked through the campus to understand how deaf-blind people see through all sorts of different sensory tactics. I've never touched so many people in one day. This was clearly pre-COVID, but it was an experience unlike anything I have ever known. And the kind of physical barriers or like social barriers we all feel and how we interact, and especially now we have this sort of 6-foot datum to refer to is completely different. That touch is necessary. During the first 2 months of the competition, we hosted a series of workshops. The design teams were asked to host 3 workshops. So we had a bunch of artists, collaborators, deaf artist collaborators on our team, and we created 3 immersive sensory workshops and environments, and mapping exercises tied to those. So for the first one, the visual workshop, it was a video time lapse. As you can see kind of on the left, that's me moving through the time lapse. And it was a delayed projection, a series of projections on that time lapse that we called a visual echo. So it kind of made you aware of movement and the visual kind of automatic response. And then we asked people to go out on campus in pairs with Polaroid camera. You were not allowed to speak or talk if you were able, but to focus on visual inputs, stop when you saw something stimulating, take a photo, and then we placed it on a map back in the workshop space. The second sensory experience was sound and vibration. We set up subwoofers, each with a different soundtrack: hip-hop, opera, classical music, monkeys chattering, heavy metal, and people could feel the difference in vibrations between those different sound inputs. And we had sound-canceling headphones for hearing people as well, so that you could really focus on the vibration. Sorry, let me see if I can get that to go. So you could see that little string. You can imagine how that vibration for the different kind of inputs from the subwoofer could change. So again, you're awakening this whole other sensory awareness way of knowing by feeling the vibrations and the different sounds in the balloons. The third experience was olfactory. So we acquired through our artist a never-before created scent. For me, it smelled like grape soda and wintergreen, and I heard someone else say it smelled like pine sol. We created an interior quiet space where people could enter, close the door. It was in darkness, so a lot of people didn't really feel comfortable in there. But the only sensory input was the smell of this fragrance. And then we had planted that smell on paper strips across a path on campus. And we walked a trajectory, and people would put a stake in the ground every time they smelled that scent. I think I smelled that scent for almost 2 weeks afterwards in various places on my coat, or it's really powerful. Olfactory is our largest sensory recall mechanism. So the goal of these workshops was to begin to map and understand how sensory inputs affect the way that we move and experience our exterior environment once we've awakened those senses to a deeper place of awareness. And there's a human scale to each of these senses, and so we were trying to pay very close attention to the nuances between those scales, whether they were connected or episodic, how sensory input is affected by the time of day, the weather, the seasons. And by mapping existing conditions, we were able to kind of recalibrate and test how this heightened visual tactile means of orienting kind of dictated different trajectories of movement. So the competition scheme was here. It was nesting a variety of sensory pathways across the campus and sensory rooms. And that idea really, it connects back to where we began with the memorial. So jumping a few years forward here, Gallaudet University, through putting this memorial as one of their first catalyst projects before even that development project happens, is showing its commitment to confronting its past and leading a national reckoning with the destructive legacy of segregation. And this memorial will really honor and celebrate the Black deaf community's fight for educational justice in America. So the Kendall Division School is the image here on the right. Compared to other historic buildings on the campus, you get a very clear sense of how the architecture really is contributing to a sense of abundance for white students and something entirely different for the Black students. So we're at this rare and critical moment on a lot of our projects, as you just saw with Philando too. Where as a nation, we're collectively open to learning and understanding and recalibrating the wrongs, and especially in this case that were done to Black deaf students in the past. And Gallaudet is really committed to this transformational change through this project. So zooming into the area around the conference center, which is this building kind of coming in from the top of the page, and a historic old gym, actually, which is a funny, teeny tiny little gym, and is just office space now in the corner. We're nesting the project in this interstitial space between, that is the site of the original Kendall school. And we're looking at kind of spatializing these 4 key ideas. Awareness of Black deaf people and their lived experience through kind of geometries of more rigid, controlled kind of flows. The idea of freedom and Miss Miller's advocacy and how that kind of brought the city's Black, what her advocacy brought to the city's Black deaf students. And that's kind of happening through this ramble, this sort of meander, this process of discovery, and also a way of spatializing the struggle. Remembrance, sort of culminating in a more circular space at the entry of this kind of courtyard, which is where the site of the original Kendall School existed. And that sort of remembrance of the kind of courtroom struggle for justice in learning, memorialization of that building as a space. And then kind of this idea of healing for past injustices. So what we heard from all of our stakeholder engagement, this needs to be a space to commiserate, to share stories, to come together. It needs to be a space to move that does not contain or oppress, and is a space for grace. The experience of this memorial and garden needs to provide enclosed spaces that provide privacy and gathering and conversation, meeting points, a landmark, a conversation starter, has to have sensory abundance, provide calm spaces that provide a sense of comfort that is flexible and social, and that is also wild, natural, and imperfect. So this sort of brings back, for us, started to bring back some of those earlier diagrams in the competition phase, where we were thinking about how to spatialize these different sensory scales throughout the landscape, and think about how sensory paths and rooms could come to play to start to answer the stakeholder needs and experience needs. The bottom was a series of tactile kind of clay slabs where we were acting on those with different materials, again thinking about the messy kind of wild richness that they were asking for in the plant material, using hands to test how to kind of communicate, or again that sensory touch, how to carry that out in the material qualities of the project. So again, coming back to sensory paths and sensory rooms, thinking about sensory rooms at a range of scales. Gallaudet has many open, passive, and empty spaces. There's no personality to them. There's no place for small groups or intimate gatherings. No places for people to sit. I mean, that's on a campus. It's not really acceptable. And there are no Black deaf landscapes. So understanding what that was, what that needed to be for this community, and what scales of space could begin to provide that was really important. So the site is really the Freedom Garden and the Memorial, and there's a series of rooms within each for different purposes at different scales. We started to test out and visualize how this sort of in-between kind of fight for freedom and awareness zone could host some of the collaborative rooms, the gathering rooms or outside classrooms, as well as some of these intimate rooms for smaller conversations within it in a pretty small space, and then culminate at the memorial. These were some of the renderings we did to visualize. This is the social gathering room for more around 8 people in the middle of a sensory garden. There's also interpretation. I'll talk about telling the stories and quotes of some of the direct experiences of the individuals we interviewed and our co-developers interviewed. This is the outdoor classroom. The site plan, this is old, but all of our work kind of moved from this quickly into documentation. And I didn't pull some of those technical drawings for you, but the spirit of this sort of meandering freedom zone through the garden, culminating in the healing space of the memorial, looking at what that means. There's kind of a main straight path through that with a very kind of logical, chronological timeline, documenting kind of the civil rights movement and Louise's more kind of legal fight for freedom. And the garden itself is something we've spent a lot of time thinking about, both kind of landscapes that all of the Black Deaf stakeholders we engaged with recalled from their childhood, from the DC area, spaces they spent time, what trees were important historically to them, what plants signified for them, calmness, peacefulness, and also doing all of our research on the sensory attributes of those native plants to this area, and how to begin to think about creating spaces, all of these sort of sections, inventory different plant species that have different sensory qualities, color or olfactory or tactile qualities. So again, looking at all of our plants and curating the garden to be beautiful and tactile over time. Also thinking about how this spatializing stages, moving from awareness, freedom to remembrance, can become manifested in material qualities, in color and texture and size of paving. So again, looking at tying other words to these experiences, that awareness, rough, or sameness, for freedom, kind of struggle, disorienting, or barriers, for remembrance, reverence, richness, clarity. How do those words tied to those kind of experiential themes translate to materials? So again, kind of these are some of our tests. This is the closest to where we've landed. But this awareness phase, kind of sameness, starting with kind of a whiter granite pathway. This is all on the kind of curving freedom path. Freedom area where it starts to get more convoluted. This idea of struggle was something that the stakeholders really felt was important to embed in the project. So we're kind of playing with this idea of disruption and struggle with a kind of material tactile curb that kind of punctuates the garden and changes over the course of the path. It introduces interpretation and stories. And the gradient, the color of the path now starts to change. So we're going from white kind of sameness to a darker, rich granite color. Also at the memorial, there's a water feature, so that darker paver with the water on it as kind of the best way to start to show words and narratives that are going to be in the ground at the memorial. So the final piece of the project is the kind of interpretation, and we've been working with 3 Black Deaf co-developers to do a lot of the engagement. They're doing interviews and meeting with the family, meeting with alumni. We have not been allowed into those virtual spaces for a variety of reasons, and nor has any of the white kind of staff members or leadership at Gallaudet been allowed into those spaces. So we're starting now to see the narratives that have come out of that process. And thinking about how to help organize those. So this is where the chronological timeline and this idea of interwoven perspectives along the freedom path are trying to figure out how to tie all of these quotes and stories into the landscape in ways that feel right to the stakeholders, and how much history is right to share, and what do you want the visitors to learn and feel as they experience the garden. So these are just some of our tests, things that we're using to visualize and show our stakeholders, well, here are some of the narratives we're seeing, the chronological timeline being very kind of logical and easy to follow, mapped out along the bottom, whereas along the freedom path, where we have these rooms, we have these moments of kind of formalizing some of the themes, grief, remembrance, and the kind of culminating in the water feature at the end as a way to kind of heal after reading these pretty painful and powerful stories. So together, I think the memorial, the pathways, the sensory rooms are really an armature for storytelling and activism. So that's the memorial. We are at 6:35. So yeah, I think we can come back to the question that we kind of asked you all in the beginning. If anybody has anything they want to bring up and share, what questions is your work asking? Or, we'd love to hear it or field any other questions you have for us.
want to collect the questions, or do you want?
Yeah, we can collect. If you wrote down questions, you can pass them to the end of the aisle. We can collect them.
I'm curious, you guys obviously deal with really emotionally charged projects, and just from a fundamental design process, how do you guys prepare to enter into those initial conversations as a design team?
That's a great question. We've been having a conversation about this. So the question was, we're dealing with a lot of really difficult content and projects and events tied to the work, and how do we enter those conversations. We've been talking a lot with Mass Design Group as well, and I'm sure you have with Formula, about how to stay healthy and open when going into those conversations. They do a lot of memorial work as well, and are trying to actually create a bit of a self-care set of guidelines for all their staff members that work on these projects. I think internally there needs to be a lot of space and care and openness, and just sort of setting a groundwork of it's okay to cry, it's okay to feel vulnerable, it's okay to not speak if you can't speak, it's okay to stop and come back later to any of these conversations. And I think also, just as white people working in these spaces, also doing a lot of our own research and reading, and opening up conversations that are not easy is made being able to stay present in this work possible.
We also we practice decolonized nonviolent communication. We've gotten some training in that, and also training on communication within that, and somatics, paying attention to your body. And so I think that's something we have an open dialogue about in the office, and we're able to check in with each other about. But also, that's important for us to build a culture around that, and also to support each other, in those spaces. And because to be present, for anything, it's just to be open. And it's a little bit of a muscle. It's just training your body to be present for those things, and then also to figure out what you need to when you become dysregulated, is to get into a less charged space and place where you can re-regulate. So that's something I think that we acknowledge within the work, and is something that we're actively working on. And we're presenting the memorial projects. We have a lot of other work too. So I think it's this balance of project types. We realize too, when we're staffing, for these really charged projects, that there should a person should have no more than one of these. So there's projects that have sort of a different trajectory and community around them. And our the program is sort of different. Yeah.
So going off of that, that's interesting. I was kind of wondering how the practice is working with these charged projects versus more what we call mainstream projects. How do the charged projects inform or enrich those other projects that don't have that element in them? Are you seeing that occurring in the work, or?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's two parts of that. There's sort of a lot of these charged projects are also a little bit more on the, they don't have a lot of money, or they don't have a lot of funding, unfortunately. So there's kind of a balance of the energy that it takes to do them is the same as, if not more than, the energy it takes to other projects. So there's also kind of a balancing of moving staff around them, or having a staff member working on a more mainstream or bigger developer project, which we don't have that many of, and one of these projects is a way to just keep a deeper connection to the why behind the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I would say, and actually I might just go to a map quick. For instance, some of the work we're doing around charged projects, this is really looking at freeways in black communities in the cities, and redlining and the disruption of those communities. So there's a knowledge that comes from some of this more charged work that when we're working on sites adjacent, like we were just talking about this today, Maura is working on an MCAT campus. And so they're, working through a process. Maybe you could talk briefly about that. But we kind of, as you saw from that earlier map, we have all these, we're collecting stories from charged and uncharged spaces. And then we're bringing that knowledge forward. And there's a collective narrative or understanding of even the place where that we're working. And so even in these uncharged spaces, we're bringing these things forward, these stories forward, and kind of recognizing some of the issues we need to address, or what potential of these projects are to kind of serve a greater mission that are around some of these other things that we're addressing.
Yeah, I think the MCAD, Minneapolis College of Art and Design project, which is kind of near one of these pinker zones, let's just say near 35W, is next to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, or MIA, sort of these very wealthy estate houses that transition to art institutions that then kind of are in neighborhoods that were largely displaced by the proximity to 35W. And because they were deemed sort of, I don't remember the exact redlining language, but ghetto, oftentimes they were called. So I think the college right now is kind of facing that reality of the neighborhood they're in and trying to navigate how their campus can begin to serve or be a part of the community in a more meaningful way, acknowledge how divided they are, and understand the kind of contested history of the neighborhood around them, to be better stewards, to be more engaged, and to help their students be creative cultural leaders that are also engaged in that fabric. So I don't know, I think that was an interesting project. We used a lot of the 35W research to kind of shine a light on that history for MCAD. And we're working in North Minneapolis also with access to the river. You can kind of see up there all the gray between the kind of green, blue, and red, and the line of 35W and the river. There's no connection. That's that's intentional. So yeah, just using maps like this and kind of research and addressing that across different projects to be able to ask bigger questions. This isn't really about an overlook. We can't just put an overlook here. You need a connection. Use it for advocacy and activism on other projects.
Or even that early work we were doing on Gallaudet through Deaf Ways of Knowing in Deaf Space is something we use on a lot of projects. So I think we're taking bits and pieces of these things and we're building this sort of collective knowledge, and sometimes it's like in ways of knowing and seeing, and sometimes it's literally in the research we're doing that's translating. So it's kind of a mix of, of those two things.
There's some great questions here I think we should read.
Yeah.
I think some of them are questions for us and some of them are just questions I think that your work is asking. But what is needed in live work environments to encourage creativity in a healthy psychological and social space? How has COVID impacted this and what have we learned? How does healing architecture and the relationship with the natural environment and landscape play into this? How can our work resist the commodification of human lives? Is a human more than a machine that produces hormones?
I hope so.
How are some ways you help communities to see your biases? This is a great project question. This also might be a question for us. I think the one project where we've really been intentional about this was a project in St. Paul on the Bluffs, Indian Mounds Regional Park. It's not a park, it's a cemetery. There are a cluster of 12 mound sites in the park boundaries. And we helped kind of create a project advisory committee that was made up of leaders in the 4 Dakota tribes that kind of all talk about the river valley as Bedote, or as kind of their genesis story, their creation story. And the leadership in those tribes are TIPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, Community Dakota, kind of Urban Dakota, and all came together to think about how to create a project advisory committee to be able to have conversations about all of this, especially about what biases people who live in the neighborhood are bringing to the table because this is their park. and how do they begin to kind of unravel that. So creation of the project advisory team and stakeholder process was really engaged and collaborative with the Indigenous kind of partners. And we started with a series of like site meditations from different perspectives, poetry, blessings, burning sage and kind of blessings, understanding why this site is sacred, and telling kind of stories before going into a room to talk about the potential future. So it shifted everybody's sensibilities and understanding and context. And it allowed people to know the site in a deeper way than just the park that's been by their house their entire lives. So and that project anyway was one way we very intentionally went into community engagement to be able to shine a light on that.
And sometimes it's agencies and clients and things too. Like for instance, on our work on George Floyd Square, we're partnered with the city and Public Works, an architect, a civil engineer, many just a community engagement sort of leader. And so we're supporting on the sort of urban design side, but the city and Public Works certainly have an agenda to open up the road, and they're really interested in getting cars and buses through. And so even the diagram we showed before, which was saying actually there's a program here that's really important to understand, this should be a place for people. Let's really show about how that's evolved over time, and actually the world and the space that the community is creating here is just as important as your agenda. And so making sure we're able to visualize that so the city can say, oh, okay, hold on a second, I see what you're saying, or this is important and valuable. Or even we started the project by retelling the history of this place back to the city and back to the community, so that there was an understanding of like the ground that this project is sitting on. And again, for the city and Public Works to understand there are people here, there's a story here. This is part of this old South Side, one of the historic black communities in Minneapolis. So helping to reestablish a narrative and a place, through, and once people, a lot of times when people realize, like, oh, I wasn't even thinking about that, and that's that process of kind of alignment and sharing values.
There's some other good questions here too. Some of them don't feel for us, but how do you suggest we pull physical studies from a site when we may not have the opportunity to visit a site? How do you ask users questions that prompt more meaningful responses? How do we design space to honor someone specific while creating something meaningful for the user? And when designing for those with different abilities, how do we create an experience that is equitable for people of varying abilities? These are all great questions. Some suggestions, maybe quickly, for pulling physical studies from a site you don't have the opportunity to visit is to just draw from the research of a place. And in establishing questions, you can start to think about, for example, if we're working with the idea, let's say, of fibers of an arts kind of community or an arts campus, and I don't live in Minneapolis and I can't go to MCAD's campus, I can do research on what those plants are. I can find those plants in my own community. I can start to question, well, how does the tactile properties or the olfactory properties of these plants matter? And I can think about a set of, experiments to play with that material, in my studio desk, or to set up a set of questions about that and play with those materials in your space. You can always kind of be super creative about finding the thread you're interested in, using Google Earth to kind of zoom in and understand things, ask questions, and create kind of parallel studies to work with materials in your own space that are relevant. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I think there was a whole studio at Harvard that I was on a jury for recently where they were nowhere near their sites, and all the students were not in Boston. They were all across, it was 2 years ago, so they were all across the world really coming to this studio. And they were choosing sites that were all over, and they each found a community partner where each of their site was. And they did experiments with those community partners through the mail, through the internet. They sent stuff back and forth. There were seeds going back and forth for one project. So I think there's always ways of just kind of being creative with that.
I think to the question about questions, how do you ask users questions that prompt more meaningful responses? I think this is like the key, and this is even in the refinement of a question. And I suggest even in your design projects, I had a professor early on who just said, continue to ask the question, refine the question as either the thesis or not, but just as a way of informing something. But even to test it against someone that, we oftentimes are putting together a survey, or, for either the community or for a project team. It's usually the more that balance between something open-ended that elicits something very specific, or that gives people an entry or feel comfortable asking, and then test it on somebody. If you're in your studio, test it on someone in the studio. Test it on your brother or your sister, maybe, or your uncle or your aunt. But it's one of these things. There's an art in asking a really good question, and usually it's a little bit open-ended, but it gives people an entry point, and the things that come out of it, or test it. We just tested a set of questions for George Floyd Square within the office to see what responses we would get. So you prototype those things. So it really depends on what community and also what the goal of those questions is.
Any more questions? I don't want to keep rambling up here. I know we got dinner to be had. Yeah.
Interested in those projects of memorials that deal with a particular memory of black suffering in this country, and oftentimes maybe because of the clients or because of the political climate, they don't involve black designers. They mostly look for non-black people to address black suffering. So how do you see that relationship when it's almost like, so it happened with the Monument UBA, and it happened in many other, I almost can count all of them. It's very rarely to see a black designer heading one of those projects.
Yeah.
How do you see yourself positioning that relationship between the commemoration of black suffering and then memorialization of it, and the sort of the lack of subjectivity in that regard of the designers that maybe not have the opportunity, and maybe somebody else has to act as a form of interlocutor or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, one we've asked ourselves often in these projects. In both cases of the projects we shared, we've been invited by a partner who we trusted. Mass Design Group is Jadi is an architect who's black on that project. Jeff is a deaf architect. Because of their relationships and trust that they've built with Gallaudet, they were invited to kind of lead that project, and our working relationship with them and the trust and vulnerability we've built as a team was kind of why we entered that project. I think with especially projects like this, making sure that the stakeholder process is primary and it guides everything is really important. And co-developers is another strategy we've been using to make sure that in any project where we are not the people that are telling the stories or whose stories need to be told in these places, be it black or black deaf or indigenous, we have co-developers who we're pulling onto those teams who are getting paid to do that work, who are in charge of the narrative, and who are going to be the ones at the table asking the questions, engaging with the people whose stories are being told, and writing that work. And we make sure that those individuals have enough scope and fee to be at the table with us throughout the design process. We would not work on a project where that either intermediary was not at the table, or whether we weren't, didn't have a partner, a design partner as the lead who was, in these cases, black deaf, or black in the case of Philando with Formula.
Yeah, and we developed a long friendship and partnership with Formula Architects in Minneapolis, who are our longtime collaborators, and they invited us in to collaborate with them because we have trust and we support each other. And it's in the process of design and making, it's totally collaborative and it's open, and we're co-creating, but we're also shifting sometimes to support. and we're supporting them. In the case, in certain situations, they're the ones, leading some of the presentations, or they're the ones that have really the direct, client contact and communication. And so it's this kind of combination where we're really comfortable with shifting our roles. We don't need to lead everything. We just want, we want, when we engage in relationships, for our knowledge and our way of working to positively either impact the project, or that there's a way of seeing where sometimes we're acting more as mediums. In the case of George Floyd Square, it's an all-black led team. And then we are coming in and supporting that. And we're comfortable. We recognize, sort of our position and our experience and our whiteness in these situations. And I think it's that kind of, consciousness about who we are, but it's also building trust and showing up and having hard conversations too. So it's like, there's work involved in all of this. I'm not saying like it's easy or this is the easy way to practice, but it's the way for us to practice. And that trust, and we've worked on, I think this is probably our 5th project with Formula, and 3 of those are charged spaces. And so I think a lot of that really has to do with just trust and real relationships and the ability to have real conversations. But I agree, it is problematic. I don't think we would ever want to put ourselves in a situation where we're trying to lead something where we felt like we're trying to represent a community, whether it's indigenous community, black community, other, that's, and I think that's really important for us to understand who it is we're serving and how we can best sort of work and interface.
And speaking up and pointing out when a client isn't doing their job well either. So, it's our responsibility to bring teams to the table for these projects, or to join a team and make sure, we're supporting in the right way, stepping back, usually, in order to let those who should be leading lead. Thank you. These are
Thank
great
you.
questions.
Great question. Thank you.
Great. I hope it wasn't too much. Whatever was delayed,
Oh, it was all good. It was.
Yeah.
Let me turn this off.
Yeah, we can also turn this.